how do you bring Muslims and Jews of goodwill together and make sure that the whole thing doesn't blow up when something happens in Gaza or in Tel Aviv?
It's possible. It's possible, only impossible here in the United States, that Jews and Muslims, despite all these problems, despite all these irreconcilable, some of them, disagreements, irreconcilable differences, here in America as Americans, Jews and Muslims can do better. We can show the world what would a Jewish-Muslim reconciliation would look like.
So tonight's somewhat provocative title of tonight's lecture describes you, Yossi, as a formerly extremist Jew, and you, Abdullah, as a formerly anti-Semitic Muslim. So let's just start there. Yossi, by way of introducing yourself...
You never told me that.
It's worse. Actually, I don't call myself former. I say recovering anti-Semite.
But that doesn't flow.
And I am having some relapses in my extremism.
So it's complicated. Anyway, can you tell us a bit about your background, Yossi? What were the narratives and ideas that shaped your former or somewhat former position? Who influenced you?
Oh, well, it's the story for me begins with my father. I guess a typical Jewish way, that's how one has to answer such a question. My father was a survivor from Hungary, and he carried a great deal of rage that was almost indiscriminate against the world. It was against the non-Jewish world. And I grew up very much with the idea that you can't trust anyone in the non-Jewish world, even people who seem to be your friends, except for Muslims, and really this notion that you're. I remember my father told me a story. You can fall in love with a non-Jewish woman, and everything is fine until the first fight, and then it's dirty Jew, and that was axiomatic for me growing up, and I grew up with this deep dread of Christianity, and there was really this sense of a kind of an apocalyptic or a post-apocalyptic worldview, where the only way to understand the enormity of what had happened, the only way to process that experience was through a complete black and white perspective. And there was really no possibility for nuance. Now, I was growing up in America of the 1960s, which was not exactly Hungary of the 1940s, my father's reality. But I took that on. I took on my father's life vicariously, and I saw myself almost as a contemporary of his, and I felt that the only way in which my life would have validity was by containing as much of his life as possible. So that was the ground for my eventual turn to extremism. And when I say eventual, I mean it really happened pretty early on. Mm-hmm. I joined Beitar, the right-wing Zionist youth movement, when I was 13. And I went to their summer camp when I was 13, and it was summer camp in quotation marks. It was learning how to shoot. It was survivalist camp. You know, if it wasn't Jewish, we would be regarded as a militia in Idaho, and that was kind of my upbringing. And then I graduated. I joined the Soviet Jewry movement, and then graduated to the Jewish Defense League of the late and, for me, unlamented Meir Kahane, who in a way took my father's worldview and turned it first into a political philosophy, and ultimately, when he moved to Israel, turned it into a theology. Meir Kahane became, I think, an important Jewish theologian. One of our important post-Holocaust theologians, who turned rage and vengeance into a religious principle. He put that at the heart of Judaism. Where I connected with Kahane was in his pre-theological stage, when he was still here running the Jewish Defense League. And what appealed to me really was that here was a rabbi, a leader, who was articulating my father's worldview. And that here was somebody who was finally breaking the code of American Jewish politeness, what Meir Kahane used to call the nice Irvings of the American Jewish community. And that deeply resonated with my 17-year-old Brooklyn soul. And I became a passionate follower of a man who today I regard as the Yetzer Hara of the Jewish people, the evil inclination, the evil temptation of the post-Holocaust Jewish experience. You want me to go on?
We do, but we're going to give Abdullah a chance to answer the same question. Abdullah.
Good evening, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you all. It's absolutely a pleasure and honor to be here. I would like to add my own thanks to these organizers. Today is the first day of Ramadan. And usually
Ramadan
Muslims,
Kareem,
thank you. I cannot imagine any better place to celebrate the welcoming of Ramadan bride. That's not what we say usually, but I'm borrowing some Jewish terms. It's going to be a month of spiritual feasting. For those who are complaining about just Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av twice a year, if you want to count your blessings, try my way for about a month, and then you will see. But if this is a good time to check out the nearest mosque or the Muslim friends and colleagues, because it's a very special season to be Muslim. My story, there's nothing humorous about it. Story of many, not all, but many. In all honesty, I am sitting here before you as a recovering anti-Semite. I grew up in 1980s in Turkey, and for the first time, early teenage years, trying to understand the world, the religion, the community, the world Muslim community that I belong to. Why are we so failed and deeply broken? And why we are perpetual losers? Why the economically, socially, politically, why is this very unimpressive picture? And early on, there were some answers, but one of the most convincing black and white answers was the first book that I read about Judaism as religion and Jews as people. It was the children's versions of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's a children's version, believe it or not. There are so many different versions of it, and it convinces you that it's all about this heinous, irredeemably evil community. It's so interesting, like how much it sort of conditions you that they are so powerful, so smart. Meeting Jews who are not smart was a therapy. When I first saw a Jew who had no concept of money, I hugged him.
That was me.
But it was such a, that's what propaganda does. It gives you a very simple, very black and white answer that something is irredeemably wrong and evil and destructive about Judaism as religion and Jews as people. The second book that I read, who would guess here in the crowd? What would you think, the second book that I read? That's third book. the fellow American now, the Henry Ford's International Jew. So it's now translated into all different possible languages and published freely in many parts of the world. It gives you this whole concept of, it takes and breaks down the whole idea of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and gives you, and here's a safe scapegoat. You can blame any and every problem of the world. I'm not going to go into detail, and I don't want to reinsert the existing stereotypes. Not every Muslim, not all Muslims are anti-Semitic, but that was my experience. And I dare to say it's not unique. It's not necessarily very uncommon either. What helped me, I want to jump into your question. I didn't come the first day of Ramadan to depress myself and yourself. And I say recovering anti-Semite because if a hate gets into your DNAs early on, the ability to take that poison out of your system. Your struggle to take that poison out of your system requires a lifelong struggle. Even though I took the nearest exit, now driving in the opposite direction as much as I can. It's so interesting. My friends who knew me from those days where we used to burn Israeli flags in pro-Palestinian protests. And now what they do, I spend a month in Israel. I am taking American Muslim leaders to Jerusalem to learn about Judaism and Zionism and Israel. Of course, they couldn't recognize me. But hate stays, and remaining free from hate, remaining sober from hate requires a lifelong struggle. Lifelong, because achieving one thing, but sustaining that achievement requires, especially if you want to inspire and take many other people with you in that journey, requires a lifelong struggle. So I don't consider myself as former, but a constantly recovering in my whole process. What helped me is, first of all, studying Islam, studying religion. If you study any universal values, ethical, moral teachings of any religion, but especially Islam and Judaism, going to an Imam training school, studying Islam, studying Quran in depth, studying the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and trying to get a chance to experience your religiosity, your piety, your connection to God, independently from political activism, independently from nationalism, independently from certain political propaganda. Of course, that central ethical, moral teachings of Islam and the kind of hate that I swallowed against Jews, Judaism, and Israel, I couldn't reconcile them anymore. And that slowed me down significantly, but ultimately what helped me is to take the nearest exit and drive in the opposite direction, was to actually meet with Jews, God-loving, God-fearing Jewish brothers and sisters, and diving into the beauty of Judaism. Like, one of the most embarrassing moments is when I used to see a Hasidic, Haredi person praying in front of the Kotel, the Western Wall, like so typically dressed up like Jew, the way Moses was dressed up in the desert. I'm not making any political statements here. But yeah, I used to be filled with rage, literally. I used to feel you and what you represent is the reason why my people and my community is in great struggle. And then when I read the English translation of those prayers that they were saying in front of the Kotel, the Western Wall, I mean, it was such an embarrassing, incredibly embarrassing and shameful moment. Well, how beautiful they were glorifying God's name. And how beautifully they were saying, untie the knot from my tongue so I can glorify your name. I can sing songs and praise your songs and praise your names. The same God that I worship was in that language, but that symbol was a source of and trigger of rage and anger and hate in myself. So studying my own religion through its own resources and meeting God-loving, God-fearing Jews was the major transformation for me.
Yossi, what was it for you? Was there a moment of insight or a person you met who changed the way you were thinking?
Well, it's interesting because Abdullah, you're speaking. You had this wonderful phrase before of staying sober from hate. Just a beautiful phrase. And as I got older, I realized that I had oversimplified my father's worldview. And I began to think back on some of the stories that he'd raised me with. So, for example, he survived the war by hiding in a hole in the forest. And there was a non-Jewish forest keeper who kept him and his friends alive. They would bring food to him. And my father told me this story when I was young, and he told me the name of the person who had saved him. He didn't tell me the names of his two friends with whom he had been hiding. And so, but he made sure that I knew this name. And when I got older, I thought this was really strange, because on the one hand, he's telling me you could never trust any non-Jew. On the other hand, he was telling me that a non-Jew had saved him. And the way that I began to process this was my father had been so overwhelmed by the experience, and it was an apocalyptic experience. And the only way he could convey that to me was through black and white reality. And he was trying to protect his children in a dangerous world. And his message was, you need to be alert. Don't be a naive, stupid Jew. That was really his message. more than you can never trust any non-Jew. And so it occurred to me that he wanted me to know that the message he was conveying to me was actually imperfect. There actually were exceptions, significant exceptions. And so this man who saved my father's life became for me a constant challenge. What do I do with him? I'm alive because of a non-Jew who I'm not supposed to trust. And so gradually, my father's worldview broke down for me. Interestingly, it also broke down for him. And as my father got older, he really began to make his peace with the world and was a very loving man. And that came through more and more as the war receded. So seeing him and his transformation and going through my own process of realizing that I actually am not a survivor. I actually was born in America. I grew up in the 1960s. And the Jewish reality of my generation was so drastically different from the reality of my father's that the distance between us should have really been measured by centuries rather than decades, because it was a total revolution in Jewish life. And so I began to take ownership of my generation's Jewish experience. And I grew up in what was the most privileged Jewish generation, certainly in the last 2,000 years, but probably ever, to have grown up in the most accepted diaspora community in Jewish history, with the option of then becoming an Israeli citizen of a sovereign Jewish state. So I began to realize that the worldview that my father felt he had to impart to me was inadequate for me as a Jew, as a post-Holocaust Jew. And I'd say there were two very powerful experiences for me. One was moving to Israel and being drafted into the army during the first Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising against the occupation, and serving in Gaza refugee camps. Now, I don't accept the easy formulation that the victims have become the victimizers. I think the conflict is a lot more complicated than that. But I also could no longer continue to sustain a victim narrative of the Jewish people or of myself being a soldier in a Gaza refugee camp. It became a ludicrous way of seeing myself and seeing the Jewish people. And I'd say that the hard gift of Zionism to our generation was that it has forced us out of the identity of victimhood. The other very powerful experience was working as a journalist in Europe for a year, the year of 1989, 1990, the crucial transformative year in Europe. I was in Berlin just after the wall fell. I was in Poland just after Solidarity took over from the communists. And I followed the falling dominoes of communism throughout that year. And what that experience did for me was reinforce the notion that I was no longer living in the post-Holocaust era. The post-Holocaust era for me ended in 1989. We're in a new era. I don't know what to call this new era, but we are no longer in the post-Holocaust era. And so we're in an era of great ambiguity for the Jewish people. On the one hand, our survival is still being threatened. On the other hand, we're occupiers. It's a very complicated reality we're in. But that clarity of living as a post-Holocaust Jew ended with the fall of communism, the opening of the Iron Curtain, the end of the forcible exile of 3 million Jews in the Soviet Union. And so I accepted the judgment of history that we need to psychologically begin to think of ourselves in a different way.
So the other part of the title of this panel is Across the Abyss. And I wonder if you can give us some insight into what is the abyss? What are the contours of the abyss between Jews and Muslims in the United States and perhaps beyond, if you want to address that? And then, how is it that each of you has begun to reach across it towards one another, but more broadly as well?
Sure. I think this is an easy question. What's wrong with Jewish-Muslim relations is an easy question. If you think Jews and Muslims are having a really good time, if you think Jews and Muslims are locking arms and singing Hina Matavu Manayim, you are either smoking something or or you are paying attention to very marginal, non-representative, happy, clappy people who likes to get together, eat hummus, and eat kosher chicken, halal chicken together. I think we can only bridge that abyss, or even, I don't know if it's bridgeable in some communities, if we can bring people close enough that we can actually bridge that, if we absolutely operate out of sense of and spirit of honesty, that we are not doing well as Jews and Muslims and Jewish-Muslim relations, despite relatively speaking our better history, despite it wasn't rosy, it wasn't egalitarian 21st century, Jews and Muslims all equal citizens. It was hierarchical, but in its own context, if you analyze Jewish-Muslim relations prior to the 20th century, it was nothing compared to Europe. There is nothing absolutely close to Spanish Inquisition, absolutely nothing close to Holocaust. And despite incredible similarities between Judaism and Islam, despite incredible, we were just talking about this, like there is no spiritual, theological anxiety, dietary anxiety when I'm in the Jewish space. I feel so at home once I took that poison of anti-Semitism out of my system. And if you only think about the legal normative part of Judaism and Islam, it's so almost identical. I'm not undermining our differences. It's a two distinct religion. But we have a lot more common than any other religion that you could think of. But lately, the 20th century and the kind of creation of the state of Israel and the way that creation of a Jewish homecoming story has been perceived and understood and experienced, right or wrong, but that's the reality, has created a new form of rapid deterioration of Jewish-Muslim relations and an increase of a very new form of non-theological and mostly political, but increasingly becoming religious Muslim anti-Semitism, and increasing amounts of anti-Muslim bigotry, anti-Muslim bias, and even hate within the Jewish community. And my brother can give more examples about that.
Yeah, I would just like to add that in defining the abyss, I think the tragedy of Muslim-Jewish relations today is that we perceive each other as the latest incarnation of our worst historical fears. For many Jews, certainly I'd say most Israeli Jews, the Muslim world is the latest stage of what we say in the Haggadah, that in every generation there arises an enemy to destroy you. And that today is perceived to be the Muslim world.
We are the new Amalek.
I wouldn't say Amalek. I would. It's enough to say the next great enemy. I think. Well, on the far right, Jewish far right, definitely Amalek. On the Muslim side, we are the personification of their powerlessness, their helplessness. The settlements reinforce this sense of the occupation, reinforces the sense of what Abdullah was speaking about earlier, the sense of historical failure. And so so here we are reinforcing exactly each other's greatest fears. What is the great Jewish fear? That our very existence is being called into question. That our legitimacy, our right to exist is the issue. And what is the issue that we're debating about with the Muslim world? The right of Israel to exist. And so this dynamic of, on the one hand, we reinforcing the sense of helplessness and despair in the Muslim world through the occupation, and the Muslim world reinforcing our fear of our own legitimacy being questioned by denying the legitimacy of Israel. That process reinforces itself and creates a dynamic in which we end up really in the abyss.
We can even answer this question with a simple psychological test. If you ask an average Muslim, what do you think of Judaism as religion, Jews as people, Zionism as an ideology, and Israel as a state, what are the top 10 things come to your mind? And similarly, if you ask a regular Jew today, when you think of Islam, Muslims, what are some of the initial images and sentiments and colors and realities? It's not very flattering. I will quickly just tell one of my delightful experience of trying to get that poison out of my system and bridging Jewish-Muslim relations. Once I was invited to speak in a church on Saturday morning in a confirmation class. I finished my lecture. I have a few more hours to spend basically before my flight, and I saw this beautiful synagogue. Beautiful. It says Shabbat is at this time, community hours at this time, and it ends with everybody is welcome. Like, part of being religious is you take everything literally. It's a problem. Like, oh,
You didn't see the fine print, did you, underneath that?
Almost everybody.
exactly. I mean, in many ways, Jewish-Muslim relations, the whole thing is a joke. What relations are we talking about? So I never miss any opportunity. I immediately went in. They already finished davening, and they were in the community hour schmoozing, as we say in Yiddish. And then I put a name tag, Abdullah. I went and introduced myself to the rabbi. And it's so interesting. I mean, the next thing I know, the 3 policemen was asking my ID. Literally, a few people saw my name, heard my accent, and looked at my appearance, I guess. A Muslim is in the shul. So the only thing they could imagine was I was going to blow up the building. I mean, it turned out to be an incredible embarrassment, and they invited me back as a scholar in residence. We are an incredibly wonderful friendship community. But that knee-jerk reaction of a Muslim presence, and it would be similar if a Hasidic Jew shows up in a mosque, especially in some parts of the world, it'll be somewhat similar.
Unless he's Natura Carta.
Exactly. We'll talk about that. I think we have to bring ourselves to the level of honesty. Look, what kind of Jews are Muslims are listening to, and what kind of Muslims are showing up in Jewish events and activities. Look, what is many Jews' sources of information about Islam and Muslims? What are they reading? What are they following? And look what kind of source of information that Muslims are consuming about Jews and Judaism, Israel and Zionism. We are not in a very impressive situation. If people are not being dismayed and motivated to action, they are either not paying enough attention or they feel they are surrendered to the level of hopelessness and despair that this unimpressive picture is presenting for us.
So what's the antidote to this knee-jerk reaction to fear, or to this sort of maintaining this kind of ignorance, or, as you put it, Yossi, sort of replaying our worst historical fears? How can we respond differently?
Well, what we've done, really as Abdullah's initiative, was create an educational program, which our hope is that this will be reciprocated on the Jewish side. We started with a group of young, emerging Muslim American leaders who were willing to take the extraordinarily courageous step of coming to Israel under Jewish auspices, under the auspices of a Jewish educational institute, an Israeli institute that defines itself as Zionist, and to study, to commit themselves to a year of study, a total of 1 month in Jerusalem and the rest here, to explore how Jews understand themselves. What is it that Israel means? Why is peoplehood, land, sovereignty essential parts of Jewish identity? And this is something that I was actually surprised by how little Muslims understand about who we are. Now, that is also reciprocated. But the sense that, we live in in a world in which, well, certainly you here in the United States, you live in a society where it's taken for granted that there's a certain basic knowledge of Judaism, Jewish history, and that knowledge cannot be taken for granted in the Muslim world, even with American Muslims. And so, for example, the first day of the first cohort, when one of our lecturers was explaining the 4,000-year Jewish connection to the land and the centrality of the land of Israel in Judaism as a religious concept, one of our participants raises his hand and said, so what you're saying is that you're here not just because of the Holocaust, but because you have a historical connection. And Abdullah and I wordlessly looked at each other from across the room and said, Dayenu. And so that's an indication, I think, of how a basic goodwill on one side and a willingness on the other side to reciprocate with an honest educational program, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, creates a dynamic that really can be transformational. Now, when I say an honest program on our side, and Abdullah, you can, I think, really say more about this, about why MLI, the Muslim Leadership Initiative, which is Abdullah's initiative. And I always say that when I speak about MLI, that I've come to realize that the most important word in the Muslim Leadership Initiative is actually the word initiative, because this was not a Jewish initiative. This was not the Hartman Institute saying, let's go out and find Muslim leaders and teach them about Zionism and Israel. It was a group of Muslim leaders, Abdullah and his friends, coming to us and saying, can you tell us who you are? Because we live with Jews, we associate with Jews, we have Jewish friends, we like Jews, but we really don't understand who you are. We don't understand when we try to say to Jews, well, let's talk about, we're happy to talk about religion, but let's not talk about Israel. And there's this pushback, and Jews say, well, you can't understand who we are without understanding Israel. So tell us who you are. And the reason, or there are several reasons, but I think one of the reasons why this program has been successful, and God willing, we're about to graduate our third cohort this summer. They're coming back, the third cohort is coming back in July for its final program in Jerusalem. That will give us over 50 graduates over the last 3 years. And these are people who are in the top tier of their communities on all kinds of levels, intellectually, communally. It is really an extraordinary group of people. And what you'll hear at the Hartman Institute, where we are accustomed to getting the top levels, certainly within the Jewish community, to some extent within the Christian world as well. What you will hear Hartman teachers say is that the MLI groups are by far among the very best of any groups that we've had at the Institute. And I think the reason why it works is because what our reciprocal gesture to the courage and the initiative shown by the MLIers has been is to say to them that we are going to treat you as we would treat any group of Jewish leaders that come to the Institute, which is to say, without self-consciousness, without self-censorship, oh, how is this going to sound? But to play out all of our struggles, all of our imperfections and failures and aspirations, and to share those with our Muslim partners. And that creates a dynamic which I think has really been extraordinary.
I want to answer your question, Rachel, a little bit differently. You said, what's the antidote?
Yeah.
I think part of the antidote is a wrong diagnosis of the problem. For many, many Jews and Muslims, for understandable reasons, they think the problem is crazies. The problem is evil organizations, evil people like Hamas and terrorists. And once, if these people are gone, the problem will be solved. Yeah, they are a problem. Of course, they are horrible people doing horrible things in different parts of the aisle. But to me, the real problem is, I think, the majority of Jews and Muslims are moderates. And many of them are moderates in a sense that they are not as determined as their crazies. They are silent. They are not as active. They are not as committed as their fringe, sort of violent, exclusive communities. Until and unless we are going to inspire, shake the imagination of these lazy moderates, unless we move them into action, unless we make them loud enough to silence the marginal, fringe, exclusive, dividing, polarizing, violent elements in their society, we are not going to be able to solve this problem. We are not going to be able to bridge this abyss necessarily. I think a lot of people are saying, why are you wasting your time preaching the choir? These are not the problem. I say, I cannot disagree more. We are part of the problem. So long as we remain as lazy moderates, so long as we cannot transform our lazy moderate Jews and Muslims into radical peacemakers, radical bridge builders, there will not be any abyss building whatsoever. I mean, I have been at Duke University for about 8 years. From day one, there is one very unique, non-representative Christian community from Lynchburg, Virginia. I don't know who they are because they never give their real, there's only a Gmail account of them. Every week they are sending me a material, in short saying God will barbecue me in the dungeons of hell if I don't become Christian. It's not all Christians are like that. Of course, they don't represent entire Christianity, but they never fail to send that letter to me for 8 years. I admire the dedication. I admire the persistence. It's unbelievable. How many of you have taken a noble cause and said, I will do this every single week? Unbelievable. Until and unless overwhelming majority of Muslims and Jews, especially in America, we are peace-loving, caring people, but we are not as active, as determined, as inspired, as motivated, as committed, as generous as the fringe crazies of our communities.
It strikes me that in both of your stories, of your own transformations, you engage in a certain level of self-critique. Right? You're looking at your story, you're looking at your past, the ideas that you've inherited from your parents or from your culture, and part of the way the transformation happened was that you were able to critique them in some way. I want to know what is the role that self-critique should play in crossing this abyss. And Yossi, if you'd be comfortable also speaking to the role that self-critique should play as we think about our relationship with Israel, to what extent is it okay for us to be critiquing ourselves even out loud?
Well, I don't think we have a choice in the sense that that's who we are as a people. That's really who we've, I think, always been. I mean, the Talmud is a collection of arguments. And what I think is so significant about the Talmud is that the redactors of the Talmud decided to keep the opposing opinions that were rejected in the book, rather than just say, well, this is the law. The law goes according to these rabbis and not these rabbis. We know the arguments because, in some sense, we're supposed to continue those arguments, and those are arguments with ourselves. And I think there is an important distinction between self-critique and self-recrimination. And Abdullah and I speak a lot about this, that one of the problems in Muslim-Jewish relationship is that you have a growing number of Jews who indulge in self-recrimination. And when Abdullah came to me with this idea 4 years ago, he said, I want authentic Jews. I want Jews who are proud of who they are, mainstream Jews, because I'm going to bring you mainstream Muslims who don't look for the nearest microphone to apologize for being Muslim. And I don't want those kinds of Jews in my dialogue. I want an authentic Muslim-Jewish relationship. And so I think that's really what we've tried to create. So I think there's a very important distinction here between the capacity for self-critique, which is essential for I think one's own spiritual integrity and for the integrity of a relationship, and at the same time not crossing the line into a kind of a undignified, excessive self-recrimination.
I think it's the essence of Islam and Judaism. If I can borrow our mutual friend Daniel Hartman's, when you go to Yom Kippur, when people are sort of beating their chest, they are talking about their own sins. They are not going and beating the chest of the one on the left and the one on the right. This is what you have done wrong. Similarly, if you really summarize the whole experience of Ramadan on one food, it's a month of almost IRS auditing. That everything that you do, all the spiritual disciplines that you take on, it should slow you down in all the external journeys, all the external judgments of others, but slowing down and starting internal journeys. And look at your pluses, look at your minuses. I'm 43 years old. Where am I in my journey? Where am I in my journey of upholding the ideals of my faith? Where am I in my journey, in my relationship with God? How much I'm experiencing the presence of God in my life? It's not just going to the Yossi's book and Rachel's book and looking what are the pluses and minuses. It's the essence of our religion. It's the essence of being an ethical, moral human being, to be self-critical, absolutely. This should be the basis of, and quite honestly, this is one of my measures in respecting somebody. If anybody lacks in sufficient level of self-criticism of him or his community or his religion, and constantly blaming others and pointing fingers, there's something fundamentally spiritual and emotional wrong with that person. But I also would like to echo Yossi's very beautiful caution, but that self-criticism should not turn into self-deprivation or self-hating. There are so many self-hating Jews circling around, validating already existing monstrous image of Judaism and Jews in Muslim community. And I would say there is a similar kind of problem. People who have issues with their Muslim identity, basically going around more than happy to self-validate and promote those kind of. There's a difference between self-criticism and self-hating.
And one of the dirty sticks that Muslims and Jews use against each other is that we have a tendency to celebrate the self-haters on each side. And so the heroes in certain circles in the Jewish community are those Muslims who aren't Muslims anymore, who have repudiated Islam and say, yes, Islam is actually evil. And in the Muslim community, I mentioned the Neturei Karta before, only half jokingly. Neturei Karta are celebrated.
Do you know who they are?
Who are they?
Most Jews I met, they don't even know who they are.
Neturei Karta, ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionists. They're the ones who stand at the Salute to Israel parade with the sign saying we're not Zionists, it's not Judaism. They're about 200 people worldwide. And interestingly, that many Jews don't know who they are, but I would say that many Muslims do know who they are.
As certain people are shaping the image of Islam and Muslims for many of my Jewish brothers and sisters, these non-representative, marginal, people who have clearly some issues with their own people and own religion, is shaping the image of Judaism and Zionism and Israel and Jews for many, many Muslims, unfortunately. Why? Because the mainstream Jewish community and the mainstream Muslim community are not in conversation with one another.
And so we're not trying to minimize. I think this is really important to say. We're not trying to minimize the serious differences between Muslims and Jews. I don't mean religious differences only. In particular, the political worldviews, debates about Israel and the Palestinians, who's responsible for the absence of peace. We have very, very serious disagreements among us. Is Israel's use of force in Gaza legitimate, or is it excessive? These are very serious arguments that we have among ourselves. But what we have tried to neutralize is the question of the legitimacy, the existence of Israel. Once I feel, as a Jew, that I'm dealing with Muslims who accept my existence as a given, and that I don't have to be worried about fighting for the very space that I exist on, then we can have arguments. We can have conversations. And that's really, I think, one of the keys here in what we're trying to do, is create a conversation that accepts as a matter of course the differences among us. And I'm not trying to convince my Muslim partners about any Israeli policy. That's not our goal. And I think it's one of the ways in which parts of the Jewish community have mishandled the relationship with the American Muslim community. That should not be the goal. The goal should be creating a conversation in which we can really disagree about policies, but trust each other's basic decency and trust each other's basic concern for the well-being of the other.
So I'm going to turn to some of the questions that you all have submitted. This question asks, as a member of my campus Hillel and the president of my school's Israel Club, I have reached out to members of the Muslim Student Association and the Students for Justice in Palestine to create some Jewish-Muslim or Israel-Palestine dialogue. But I've been rebuked because they see us as their oppressors. Do you have any advice for how I can move forward?
Everybody is looking for a silver bullet, right? I highly encourage this person to get to talk to me after the event. But I think one of the primary front lines of Jewish-Muslim relationship struggles are going to continue to be on college campuses. And this is not as black and white as Jews against Muslims. And as you know, in the BDS movement, in the SJP movement, there's a significant number of Jewish community. On my campus, it's 60% of its members are Jewish. Its faculty is an Israeli. The faculty is Israeli. So it's not as simple as black and white as many issues could say. And I think on this campus and other campuses, there needs to be a lot of pre-work. There needs to be a lot of pre-work and creation of a space for a meaningful conversation. Without creating a space, I've been a college chaplain for about 15 years now. And I saw so regretfully that the space for a meaningful conversation has shrank into very small. Like 10 years ago, criticizing the state of Israel and anti-Semitism on all sides of the aisles, there was about a mile. A mile is good, like you could have a conversation there. Now that shrank into, in some places, only into 2 inches. You can't have a conversation in 2 inches. First, we have to create those conversations. On one side, we have to allow legitimate criticism to be aired. We have to allow, we should not let this kind of increasing tension and polarization. What's unfortunately happening is, what should not happen, on all sides, people are throwing money and zeal into propaganda. People are investing in talking points of some people. They are not interested in creating homegrown, indigenous conversational spaces on college campuses and other places. And there is no easy way out this. Like, we have to really work out first personal relationships and a little bit of education. I have seen this over and over and over and over. If you can develop a little bit of respect, a little bit of education, that's what Shalom Hartman is giving to its participants. Incredible amount of neutral education. And if you can create a little bit of a safe space where you can handle some legitimate criticism, it goes a long way.
So the student goes back to campus. What's the one first step that he or she can take?
Invest in individuals in the Muslim Student Association. Invest in personal relationship with credible people who may have irreconcilable differences with you, who may have irreconcilable political disagreements with you. Yet, don't only talk to people whom you agree. Since when we only talk to people whom we agree? Since when we make peace with people whom we actually are on the same page? We only make peace with our people who we have issues with. But I have also a few Muslim tricks that I want to teach her or him. Please see, in terms of icebreakers, that we should talk.
Great, great. I think that everyone's going to come talk to you after this is going to happen. So how easy or difficult is it to get Muslim recruits for MLI? And do you see attitude change and bridge building in the communities that these leaders then return to?
Can I actually, do you mind if I put you on the spot, Harun? We have one of the best and brightest participants of MLI program. Since I'm the recruiter, of course I will say certain things But as someone who's been recruited, how would you answer that question? Do you mind if I put you on the spot?
Well, it's too late now. Harun Mogul. Harun, stand
That's,
up.
by the way, that is exactly how Abdullah recruits.
Please come over.
Yeah.
Abdullah recruited me by telling me it'll be a great program and it'll be fine. And years of psychotherapy later, I'm a little bit better, and now I actually work for Hartman, which I wouldn't have seen coming. It's a challenge. It was a bigger challenge to get people on board for the simple reason that the program, as Yossi described it, is very hard to describe. Many of these initiatives between Muslim and Jewish communities tend to either focus on, hummus and we all love Abraham. So, we have no differences. Or they attempt to discuss the differences and immediately the whole thing blows up in everyone's face and no one ever talks to anyone again. And that, in my experience, has happened time and time and time again. This is different because, as Yossi pointed out, it's about learning how to talk to each other, accepting differences, and acknowledging each other's humanity. At first, it was very challenging to get people on board simply because people viewed it within the Muslim community, unfortunately, as a form of co-optation or indoctrination. But the quality of people on board, I'm really honored to be part of this group. The quality of people is absolutely stunning. And these are people with real roots in Muslim communities and authenticity in Muslim communities. Every place I've gone to, every Muslim community I've gone to, there have been attempts to boycott me because of my participation in the program. They have been shut down by every single community that's invited me. Which is a mark of the success of the program, where you get people who cannot be excluded from their communities. And because once you reach a critical mass, and this is happening, it's a lot easier for people to sign on board. The number of people now is greater than the number of seats available by many orders of magnitude. And these are really talented people from every ethnic background, religious background, sectarian background, professional background, from every geographic part of the country who want to be part of this program. And I think it's a testament to what Abdullah and Yossi have built. So thank you very much.
As Harun so eloquently and beautifully said, action speaks louder. Despite an incredible opposition to the program, the number has grown. Instead of one cohort, now we are taking 2 cohorts.
A year.
2 cohorts a year. And the number of participants in the cohort, number of people who have standing and representation power within the American Muslim community has grown tremendously. We have to defeat that despair and culture of hopelessness, that many Muslims think there are no Jews that we can talk to. And many Jews say, where are the Muslims? Mm-hmm. There are no Muslims that they can talk to, they can have a reasonable, meaningful conversation with. For those who are involved at this Get to Know MLIers, they have no right to say, where are the moderate Muslims? Hinani, here we are.
One thing that I think we really need to emphasize is that you here in this country have an opportunity to create a more normal model for Muslim-Jewish relations than probably any other place in the world. And that has a lot to do with the nature of the American Jewish community, the nature of the Muslim American community, the nature, I would have said the nature of America, although I don't know at this point. One can hope that the decency of America will prevail. And the very challenges to that decency that we're seeing rising in recent months is actually a potential catalyst for bringing Muslims and Jews in this country closer together. And that there really is a need to create at least, and again, I don't want to gloss over the profound difficulties and disagreements that exist. And I think one of what makes MLI work, this is a tangent now, but what makes MLI work is that we are relentlessly, almost brutally real. We are so wary of self-delusion. And because of that, there's a sense when MLI convenes, there really is this deep sense of anything and everything can be discussed. But the point really is, in terms of America, you have a chance here, and I think it's an historic opportunity and responsibility of the American Jewish community to try to reach out and to reciprocate, because significant parts of the Muslim American community have already reached out to you. And the reason that MLI was founded by Abdullah, and this I learned from Abdullah immediately, I asked him, why are you doing this? And he said, it's not for you, it's for us Muslims. It's not for you Jews. I'm not doing you any favors. I need to find allies in the American community, and I think the Jewish community is a natural address for that, and I need to show the Jewish community goodwill. I need to show the Jewish community that there are Muslims in this country who really are ready to hear a Jewish story, to try to understand who you are. Now, we're here, we're doing this little road show here, in part because our appeal to the Jewish community is a gesture has already been made, more than a gesture. And now we need the Jewish community to reciprocate. And that's why I'm really grateful to the Jewish Week, to the Synagogue for being the vehicle for that reciprocal outreach.
I love the Psalms 96 and 98, when God says to David, Shiru Adonai Shir Hadash, sing me some new songs. Sing me some new. That means the old songs that we've been singing is not working. The old songs that we've been singing is further polarizing us, dividing us, further fueling the fire of hostility, bias, and hate, and enmity towards us. I hope this class of 2016, this new generation, they are in a better situation, especially in America, to sing some new songs, inshallah.
Inshallah, you've given us our charge. We need to be singing some new songs.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.